want to welcome everybody here. It's an honor to be on this panel today and to welcome Chairman Omala Ishitela back to our conference, and Diep Olabala, Mwamba Ishitela. So this is going to be really powerful. As Jesse said, I'm a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. This is the organization of white people working in the white communities, when we say North American or European communities, organizing other people just like ourselves to recognize that African people are colonized inside the borders of the United States and struggling for liberation of African people as one people all around the world. We're going to talk about that a little bit more, but the focus of my presentation right now is the fact that it is pretty well acknowledged that the U.S. is waging a war against the people of Afghanistan, and in its own self-definition, that war is a counterinsurgency, a war against people who are rising up to defend their own land and their freedom and their self-determination. But what is not widely recognized, what is not talked about, and what we don't see a stand taken around in this country is that the U.S. is also waging a war against the African community. And this is what I want to show, and I want to talk about that a little bit, and we will be discussing the reality of that tonight. Uhuru, so stop the war against the African community, and we say solidarity with the right of African people to resist, to have self-determination and liberation. The understandings in this presentation are based on the theory, it's called African Internationalism, the theory of seeing the world through the eyes of the African working class, and this is the understandings of the Uhuru movement, and this theory was developed by Chairman Omala Ishitela. Under Obama, the U.S. is escalating the war in the Mideast and around the world. Obama's war budget is greater than that of any previous president, and that is really important to understand, that Obama represents the interests of white power, of imperialism. He is what the party calls neo-colonialism, and we saw under Bush some sense of an anti-war movement. But yet we have Obama escalating the war in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and in other parts of the Middle East, and we see no response except for the Black is Back coalition. We see just a paltry, weak kind of response, if at all, from the people who put themselves forward as the peace movement. Obama's war budget is nearly $700 billion. There's 150,000 troops in Afghanistan, a 600% increase in operations, in military acts and campaigns going on inside of Afghanistan right now. But what is not talked about is that Obama is also intensifying the other war, the war against the African community that goes on right before our eyes every day, here in St. Petersburg, in Philadelphia, and all around the world, all around the country. In Afghanistan, people are forced to live in a U.S. war zone. In the African community in the U.S., people live in a war zone. In Afghanistan, it's based on one of the most impoverished countries in the world. The people are colonized. They do not have power over their lives. They're fighting for their self-determination. Inside the U.S., African people are impoverished and colonized. 1/3 of all African children live in poverty. African people have 10 cents for every dollar that white people have in this country right now in 2011, and that gap is growing. In Afghanistan, it's a people under siege, military occupation. In the U.S., African community, it's a people under siege, under military occupation. We see special forces in Afghanistan. We see special forces in the U.S. African community. Every kind of SWAT team, every kind of highly militarized police force, every possible, I mean, how many different forces are implanted in the African community? DEA and and SWAT and the Green Team and drug forces and every possible kind of police force that you could ever imagine. There are mercenaries in the Middle East, Blackwater now called Z, mercenaries in the African community. And increasingly you're seeing that. Where cities like Oakland, California, and of course this is New Orleans, but there are cities all over the country that can no longer afford their police budget, so they're jobbing the police out to mercenaries in the city. We have checkpoints famous in Palestine where the people are stopped and have to go through police interrogation and all kinds of searches in Palestine. This is well known, and it happens of course in Iraq and other places as well. Checkpoints in the African community is called stop and frisk. In New York City alone, 600,000, mostly African and other oppressed and colonized peoples, searched and stopped by the police. There, something like 250,000 or more in Philadelphia, and this is going on all over the country. There's U.S. tanks in Afghanistan. There's U.S. tanks in the African community. This was New Orleans. That's one example, but that's not the only example where that kind of military force is called out against the African community. U.S. helicopters over Afghanistan. U.S. helicopters, for one example, of course they're flying over the African community all the time. If you live in or near that, you can see that. But also, this is the helicopter that dropped the firebomb on the Move family's house in Philadelphia that killed 11 men, women, children, and burned down 63 homes in the African community in 1985. U.S. uses drones against the people of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Miami Police Department just bought a drone, and it says there are spy drones in demand by U.S. police, increasingly being used. Military police containment is what is happening in Afghanistan and in the Middle East. Police containment against the African community, and you can just note that's a U.S. postal truck that the police are coming out of. Collective punishment in Palestine, a whole people punished for the acts of supposedly of a few singled out. Collective punishment in the U.S. against the African community, exactly the same things are happening. We see mass roundups, imprisonment in Palestine and in Afghanistan, mass roundups, imprisonment of African people. In this country, where 2.5 million people are in U.S. prisons, 50% at least are African. You see U.S. murder of civilians in Afghanistan all the time. That has increased incredibly under Obama. Police murder of civilians in the African community. This is the murder, the blatant murder of Oscar Grant in Oakland, California on January 1st, 2009. And the only reason that was distinguished from any other police murder that goes on almost constantly in every city around the country is that it was on the BART station and the trains were in and people had their cell phones and they were videoing it and taking pictures of it. So they couldn't make up a story about what they said happened. People had the truth that this young man was shot point blank in the back by the police. We see torture. Abu Ghraib was only the most famous, infamous case that came out.